April 7th, 2001. Prior to going back out to the mystery cave again, we spent a lot of time preparing. We made a squeeze box, which is a wooden box, the opening of which can be adjusted in size. We could then crawl through the opening to measure to see how tight of a squeeze we could fit through. From that, we were able to determine that I need about 9 inches in height to get through the smallest portion of Floyd's tomb. That meant that we would have to scrape out about an inch from the floor of the passage. We also learned that the best position I would need to get through the passage would be on my stomach, with my arms by my side, and of course my head would be turned one way or the other. That position allowed my shoulder blades to drop to their lowest point. In order to move, I would push forward and backwards with my toes. It sounds difficult, but felt adequate. Later, it proved to work sufficiently. The second thing we did to prepare was to construct the tools we invented to work in the cave. I came up with a clever way to chip inside the passage without having to climb inside. I had my neighbor weld together several lengths of steel pipe in a manner that would allow us to take it apart whilst we were climbing down into the tomb, but still have the strength necessary to hold a blow from a hammer once it was together. We made our own tips that we could screw into our pipe to reach the area we needed to work on. B came up with a cool design for a scraper using angel iron. He had his neighbor weld it together. It proved to be an invaluable tool for scraping and removing the rock. We were both pretty proud of our inventions. I also made a device to hold my drill that's attached to our pipe. We ended up not using it since B's scraper device worked so well. I took an oath. I made a vow. I would not leave the cave until we made it through the passage, conquered Floyd's tomb. This would be the trip. It had been a long time since we had been out to mystery. We had been busy though. We had made the tools we had talked about. It was fun coming up with the ideas for tools. Also, we made a squeeze box to determine the best technique for getting through the tight spot. Plus, we knew about how much rock we needed to remove before we could get through. We were excited to get back out into the cave to finish our project. Our climb down to the passage took a little bit longer than usual since we had the extra tools to carry. Once we got down to the passage, we immediately got to work using B's scraping tool with the pipe that I had made. It worked like a charm. We could hammer the pipe on one end and the scraping tool on the other dug into the rock. Then we could push the debris all the way through the passage and out of our way. When we needed to measure our progress, we would turn the scraper sideways in the passage and observe the clearance. We worked for about 2 hours before I had a desire to try the tomb. I just wanted to be sure I was going to make it through on the first try. B made one more sweep of the passage floor, clearing any loose rocks from where I'd be crawling, and pushing the wall we had made to the back of the squeeze. I made preparations to crawl by fashioning duct tape suspenders to prevent my shirt from sliding around while sliding across the rock. I went with a flashlight in my hand, even though my hand would be at my side. I knew I would need it once I got through. As an expression of faith, I did not tie a rope to my feet. I was confident I was going to make it. Finally, I made an attempt. Although I didn't mention it in my journal, we did notice the breeze was back and the rumbling present. Since we didn't do any more work on the entrance, I had to go through the same dance routine to enter the passage. Once I got my upper body through the hole, I shined the flashlight ahead of me to work out a plan of attack. The passage didn't seem any bigger than the last time I was there, but most of the work was done deeper in the squeeze. I paused for a few minutes, then twisted my hips to get my lower body in. I slowly inched forward as my entire body slowly filled the passage. Before I was completely in, I got into position for the push. I dropped both of my hands to my side and turned my head to the right. Then I began to inch forward. Once my toes were inside the cave, I used them to push forward. To keep me from scraping my body, I would walk using my shoulders, knees, and toes. Progress was slow but steady. That was fine by me. A foot or two before the tight spot, I could already tell there was a little more room. Even so, I began to touch the roof of the passage with my back. This time, however, I was able to continue moving forward. I reached the lowest point in the passage and I could tell it was still going to be tricky. Even with the work we had done clearing out the loose rocks, I still felt sharp pebbles rolling under my chest as I slid along. When I could feel my back brushing across the top of the passage in several places, I reverted to my technique of exhaling. Before I began, however, I took a minute to lay there in the passage. I could see the glow of B's flashlight as the rays of light managed to squeeze past my body. I could feel the cool breeze evaporate the drops of dirty sweat on my forehead. I could feel 1,000 sharp edges dig into the surface of my skin. I felt the twinge of excitement as I realized that the goal we had set out to achieve weeks ago was about to be realized. This thought alone made me want to keep moving. no matter how tight the passages became. I breathed in and out rapidly for a few moments, then began. Exhale, scoot, stop to catch my breath, repeat. After just a few inches of scooting, I could raise my head off the floor and squeeze until the passage was beginning to open up. I relayed this information to B, and we both took a few seconds to celebrate. During the rest of the slide through the passage, B was cheering me on. Virgin Passage and Neil Armstrong territory were the phrases he kept repeating. I was grinning ear to ear. Even though the passage was beginning to get larger, I was still going slow. I had to continue scooting along another 1.5 feet before I could slide my arms underneath me and use them to crawl. At that point, I felt my journey was essentially over. I was able to sit up slightly and move the rock wall we had erected several trips ago. Those rocks served as a somber reminder that a little caution would be wise. I shouted back to B that I was through. We both took a moment to congratulate ourselves on our success. B would likely never be able to squeeze through the passage and see what I was seeing, so I gave him a description of what the cave looked like. At this point, I only had a mini-mag, so I could not see very far into the passage. The end of the passage made a gentle right turn and seemed to go for a ways. I was unable to do anything at this point but sit, due to the size of the passage. All of the broken rocks we had pushed through Floyd's tomb were around me at this point. There were no other signs of human intrusion. I had to wait until B passed me the helmet light to get a better feel for the cave. B used the pole he made to slide me an end of a rope. Then I was able to pull all my gear through the tight squeeze. The first thing he sent through was my helmet and light. After I got the light fired up, I was able to see our new section of the cave. Ours. It was an exciting experience to see the results of hours of hard work, the course of several weeks. At this point, we still had no idea what the cave had to offer. The only thing I could see was the passage immediately following the squeeze. It was a narrow passage with a low ceiling. I would easily be able to get through it, but I would have to crawl. I began taking pictures so I could show B. I asked B how far he thought I should venture into the new cave, in light of the strange events that had occurred. For the first time, he too toned down his enthusiasm as he remembered the noises. He slid the pipe through the tomb with a loosened tip on the end. He said I could use it as a weapon if I ran into an animal or something. He also told me to make sure we could hear each other as I progressed into the cave. Even though we were at least thinking of the possibility of running into trouble, we never really considered the fact that if I got into trouble, B would never be able to rescue me. In fact, no one would be able to rescue me for many hours. If I were in serious trouble, as in hurt, there was no way anyone would be able to get to me in time. But, symbolic of the whole experience, we were focused on our goal, and not the potential dangers we faced. So far, we had dodged the proverbial bullet. So far. I strapped on my gloves and knee pads, grabbed my camera, and began my adventure. I crawled through the passage, which was about 20 feet long. At the end of the crawl, the cave bent slightly to the right. I would have to climb up a gentle slope, but then I would be able to stand by the end of the next section of the cave. The next section was about 40 feet long. In addition to having a higher ceiling, the walls were a little wider than the section I had just crawled through. Both sections were relatively straight. The floor was covered in rock which crunched as I crawled, and then walked across it. The walls were basically the same as much of Mystery Cave, except pristine. It was obvious no one had been there before me. Upon closer examination of the walls, I found two delicate types of formations. The first resembled several chunks of grated cheese tied together on one end, with the rest of the cheese just flopping down. The second formation was just tiny strands of rock, thinner than human hair. It looked pretty cool. I found several examples of both kinds of formations. I was not even through for the second section of the cave, and I could barely hear B. Cave passages are not very acoustically friendly. I shouted to him that I would go on for half an hour and then return. He said that would be fine and to be careful. Then I proceeded to explore some more. I could walk nearly upright at this point. I was on the third straight section of the cave when I discovered a crystal formation on the wall to my right. It was in several layers on the wall, resembling clear candle wax that was allowed to melt and drip down the wall. There were several small stalactite-looking formations formed by these crystals. The longest was about 4 inches in length. There would have been one much longer, judging by the size of the base, but it had broken off. I looked to see if I could locate where it had ended up, but I couldn't find it. The passages continued on for another 100 feet or so before the cave opened up a little. It was at the end of the short straight segment of the cave. At the very end of the segment, the cave made a bend to the left and opened up into a room. Just at the point where the room began, there was a round rock that appeared to be leaning against the wall. This seemed odd, but singular formations are common in caves, so it was by no means unique. I'd crawled and stepped over several large chunks of rock that fell down from the ceiling, but this one was more round than the others. Once past the rock, the room opened up to a height of about 15 feet. It was also about 15 feet in width and 30 feet in length. At the far end of the room, there was another passage leading straight out. As I entered the room, I had an eerie feeling. It was like the odd saying that I felt like I was being watched. Once again, the excitement of the new find faded, and the memories of the mysterious side of the cave crept back into mind. Suddenly, I felt very alone. Fortunately for my ego, I was nearly out of time, and had to get back to B before my half an hour was up. I took several pictures of the room. I was just going to get a feel for how long the next passage was when something caught my attention. On the left side of the room on the wall at about eye level, I discovered what had to be hieroglyphics. It was a single drawing that almost appeared to just be part of the rock coloration. It looked like very crude representations of people standing below a symbol. I was pumped. This meant there had to be another entrance to the cave. Even if the entrance was closed or blocked, it might mean an opportunity to open it up and get B into the cave. I took another look at the drawing to make sure I could describe it to B. Then I took some more pictures and headed back to B. When I got back to the squeeze, I could barely talk fast enough to let B know everything I'd discovered. He was just as excited to hear about our newly found treasures. As we debated what our next move would be, I began to send the gear back through the tomb to B. I told him it would be best if he got someone else to come back with me, in case something happened. He agreed. Once I got all my gear through, I was faced with the wonderful task of having to negotiate Floyd's tomb again. Theoretically, a person should be able to get out of the passage he just crawled through by simply reversing what he had just did. If he contorts his body a certain way to get in, he should be able to get into the same position to get out. In practice, this may not prove to be possible or practical. Such was the case with the tomb. I determined in advance that I would attempt to go head first back through the squeeze. I knew that I could definitely make it by going feet first, but that would mean backing up all the way through the tomb. That would take a long time and be very exhausting. My only concern going head first was when I got to the end of the squeeze. I would have to get through the hole we made without the benefit of being able to twist my body. Oh well. I chose to go head first and deal with the exit when I got to it. I started the squeeze very close to the tight spot, so at least I would have it over with soon. It turned out to be tricky getting through. I had to shift my hips to the right a little to get through, but I just kept plugging away at it. My hands were once again at my side. My head was turned to the right and I was scooting with my toes. And once again I was using my head as a gauge to tell when I was in a tight spot, then when I was past it. I seemed to get tired a little quicker on the way out. Must have been from all the work we had done to get through. I was a little over halfway through when something bizarre happened. I was laying there taking a brief break when I heard a sound deep within the cave. It was the faint but distinct sound of rock sliding on rock. My blood froze in my veins. I couldn't move. I just lay there straining to hear the sound again. Nothing. I quickly began to scoot towards the exit. I didn't mention the sound to B, but I did recall one of our earlier trips when B said he had heard the same thing. The task of getting out of our hole turned out to be as painful as I thought it would be. I had to put my arms over my head and force my shoulders through the hole. I definitely left some skin behind as I slipped through. B helped me as I wiggled my upper body out of the passage. Then I could catch myself and ease my lower body out of the tomb. I was out. B and I shook hands and began to load up our gear. I was trying to listen out for any sounds coming from the hole, but we were making too much noise gathering our stuff. As much as I looked forward to the passage, it was a relief to get back out. That's pretty much how I feel about caves in general. I love to go in, but I feel good when I get back out again. Something strange happened with the pictures I took in the new part of the cave. The pictures I took in the passage leading up to the large room all turned out just fine. Strangely, none of the pictures I'd taken in the room turned out. Pictures of the round rock, and more importantly, pictures of the hieroglyphs I saw. Pictures before and after the room turned out great, but the negatives of the photos taken in the room were clear. Nothing. I remember what the hieroglyphs looked like, so I drew a picture to give you an idea of what I saw. April 14th, 2001. Only a couple of days elapsed before B found someone who wanted to go exploring with us. B told me he talked to a few other people who couldn't make it because of scheduling conflicts. He said they really grilled him for information about the cave and about the passage. He would not tell them which cave it was to ensure that we explored it to our satisfaction before we made it known to the public. Even the guy who ended up going with us didn't know which cave it was until we were very close to it, and he was sworn to secrecy that he would not reveal the location of the cave to anyone on the planet. I won't identify him by name, so I'll just refer to him as Joe. Joe, B, and I set out early in the morning to make sure we could spend all the time we wanted in the new passage. When we got to the cave, we were able to rig up and descend rather quickly. It helps when you don't have to haul half a hardware store down into the cave. Joe was impressed by our work. Even B and I took a minute to pat ourselves on the back for all the hard work we put in, and for the fact that we made it through. Joe is a rather thin caver who has a lot of experience in caves. He said this might be the tightest squeeze he'd ever been in, but it didn't bother him. I knew that physically he would be able to make it, since I was bigger than him and I made it. He was just as excited as us to get through and get caving. Maybe more. He quickly got ready and was waiting to hear what the plan of attack was going to be. I figured I'd be sending him through first, since he was ready, and I would follow. B would pass our gear through and wait for us outside of the passage. B would give us 2 hours to return. That was nice of B to go down into the cave and babysit us. It gets boring sitting there in the cave. With our plan set, we were ready to roll. It was perhaps irresponsible of us not to tell Joe about all of the unexplained events that occurred in the cave until we had gone through. But what exactly do you tell someone? How many of the weird things did we need to tell him? We did not feel that we were in any danger, or we'd not be going into the caves ourselves. So we did not tell him anything prior to entering Floyd's tomb. Of course, when we did tell him afterwards, it was too late. I couldn't believe how easily Joe slipped through the passage. He said it was tight, but it sure didn't look like it. Once he got in, we passed him his gear, and then I started. Even though I knew I could fit through, it was still a slow trip through the tomb. You can only go so fast when you're scooting with your toes. When I reached the tight spot of the squeeze, I had Joe snap a picture of me. I thought it would make a good photo. Once I got through, B started to relay my stuff to me. Then disaster struck. I had gone all the way in and turned around to pull my gear through. I had to kneel down and still crouch down low. I had just got my helmet, ironically, and light, and was just turning around to feed the rope back to B when I smacked my head on the top of the passage. Human skull versus solid rock. Rock 1. I told B what had happened, so he'd sent my first aid kit through. I was bleeding, but even worse, I didn't feel too good. I patched myself up, then told Joe I didn't think I'd better continue. He looked like a little kid who just told Christmas would be cancelled. Although I didn't like the idea of letting him explore the cave without me, for selfish reasons, of course. I wanted him to at least see part of the cave for making the trip out there. I told him how far to go and how long it would take. Then I sent him on his way. As I laid there, I could hear him crawling into the darkness. His light disappeared after the first turn. I rested a minute or two, then began my journey back through the tight squeeze. It was disappointing to get all the way through the cave, then not be able to explore it to its end. Actually, it is killing me. After I got through Floyd's tomb, which was painful, I sat down and munched on a Cliff Bar whilst B and I chatted. I told him I would pay for a motel room if he would stay overnight. Then we could see how I was doing the next day and make another attempt at the cave. I felt goofy for having smacked my head on the cave wall. B said he was willing to give it another try tomorrow. He was just as anxious to put some closure to this cave. As long as Joe would stay overnight, we determined to wrap things up the next day. Once this was settled, we just sat back and enjoyed the darkness. We could hear no sounds coming from the passage. The silence reminded me of the scraping noises that I heard the last time we were out there. I brought up the subject with B. Since I had not explored the cave completely, I could not offer any explanation of what could be making the scraping noises, or the change of wind strength, or the rumbling, or that terrible scream that we heard. Suddenly we both wished that we had not sent Joe into the cave alone. B went to the hole and yelled out Joe's name. No answer. Not surprising. You just can't hear each other when you're very far apart in the cave. We nervously awaited any sounds. Good sounds, that is. Joe-type sounds. The 20-minute time limit we had set passed. Then 25 minutes. I really had no desire to climb back through the squeeze. My head was still throbbing and the squeeze looked tighter than ever. Still, I knew I was going to have to make sure Joe was safe. Just as I was getting prepared to go back through, I saw a light deep in the passage. "Joe?" I called out. Nothing. "Joe!" Still no answer. The light got brighter and I could hear the noise of something crawling across the broken rock that lined the cave. "You okay, Joe?" "No," was his weak reply. When he got to the other side of the tomb, he said he was not feeling well. He quickly took his gear off and put them into the bag so we could pull it through. As I pulled the bag through the passage, he began to climb back through the tomb. We didn't even get a chance to question him about what he saw before he was coming back through. He quickly slipped through the squeeze and the hole, and we finally got a look at him. He looked terrible. His face was pale and he was out of breath. The dust that covers the floor of the squeeze left its mark on his face and clothes. He had numerous small cuts and scratches on his face and arms, probably from the rapid exit from the passage. His eyes were open wide. We only had a brief moment to look at the change that occurred to Joe before he started to head up out of the cave without saying a word. While Joe and B started for the surface, I took a minute to gather our gear. Then I stopped to listen to the passage. I heard nothing, and I felt nothing. The wind had stopped. Part of me wanted to get out of the cave as fast as possible, but another part of me wanted to immediately climb back through the passage and find out what made this cave tick. Then was not the time, though. I still felt a little dizzy from my injury. At that moment, I noticed B and Joe had made good time getting up the cave passage, and I was left alone. Chills ran throughout my body as I scurried to catch up with them. Once we got outside of the cave, I figured we would be able to find out more from Joe. But when we got to the final climb, he just unclipped from the rope and went straight to the truck. In the light of day, he looked even worse than in the cave. B and I gathered up the rope and our gear and headed for the truck. Joe said he didn't want to stay overnight because he felt terrible, and we believed him. So we headed home. We could get no more information from Joe. He just stared straight ahead. He was shaking like a leaf and he said he was not cold. When we tried to question him, his answers were short. I asked him if he saw the hieroglyphs. No. Did he hear us yelling? No. Did he see the round rock? No. Did he see the crystals? No. He said he just went a little ways in and started feeling sick. Something was fishy about his answers. He would have had to have seen the crystals if he had gotten far enough into the cave that he couldn't hear us yelling. But why would he not elaborate? The rest of the trip passed in eerie silence. Joe didn't say much else. We gave him a brief outline of the strange events that happened in the cave. He didn't reply. As we were dropping him off, we asked if he wanted to go back to the cave. He shook his head and ran into his house. I tried calling him later in the day, and the next day, but I only got his voicemail.